Hey everyone, Toony SA here with a slightly different video than usual. Reason being is that I was in a motorbike accident, so I can't do my usual death grip Crash Bandicoot speedrunning content because, you know, it hurt my hand to hold the controller that tightly. But second of all, occasionally I do want to just post videos about other games on this channel. So this is about the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion making the hardest build possible. And the reason I'm making this video is because Avowed just came out and people were comparing it to Oblivion, like a modern day game being compared to a 20-year-old game is pretty strange, but it got me wanting to play Oblivion again, so I've been playing it again, and I set myself the challenge just before I hurt my hand to basically put myself in the worst possible starting situation and then spend the game trying to overcome my awful start. So when I say making the hardest build possible, I just mean in the Oblivion tutorial where you create your character, basically making the worst character imaginable. And then when you leave the sewers, it's your job to play as well as possible to overcome all of that adversity. So it's not about playing the game as terribly as possible, because what's the point in that? It's just what is the worst starting hand you can give yourself for doing Oblivion. So the first thing that you need to do is set the difficulty to 100% on the difficulty slider, because that will do the Oblivion thing of meaning enemies will deal max damage to you and you will deal minimum damage to enemies. That's already step one to making the game as hard as possible right from the get-go. You're going to have to, actually make use of potions and scrolls for a change, because when you're playing games like Oblivion or Skyrim standardly, you have the RPG effect where you don't even want to use potions and scrolls because you think that you're going to need it for a boss later, and then you just don't end up using the potions or scrolls. You end up with like 150 by the end of the game just sat there in your inventory. So that's step one, is basically make the game's difficulty inbuilt as hard as possible. The second thing that you're going to need to do is in the character creation is you're going to have to follow what I believe to be the worst steps imaginable to create a terrible character. This is not about my favorite or least favorite character. This is just about if I was to build a character and it was going to be a terrible character, this is how I would build it. So I'm going to summarize the build right now. So if you don't want to hear the summary and you want to, keep the suspense, you can skip ahead to this point in the video to hear my breakdown. Otherwise, if you just care about what the build is, I'm going to summarize it for you now for you to have a go at. And then if you do want to hear my reasoning behind the summary, you can stick around after to listen to the breakdown as to why I think this is the worst build. Anyway, race, Bosmer, gender, female, birth sign, tower, specialization, stealth, major skills, security, speechcraft, hand-to-hand, mercantile, marksman, mysticism, acrobatics. So I've got a spreadsheet open on the US Wiki, which is a really great resource. I used to be a volunteer contributor towards it. I've not done it for a while, but and then on my right monitor, I've got my my points to go through. So the first decision you're going to make is your appearance. Your appearance obviously doesn't matter in the game, just how proud you are. But if you really, really want to, compound how awful a build your character is, you can make your character atrociously ugly, which is ironically the easiest thing you can do in Oblivion, is make really ugly characters. But then we get to the first major decision, which is what race and gender should you choose? Now, the worst race you can choose in the game, objectively based on the starting abilities and stats, is the Bosmer, which is the Wood Elf. Now, nothing against the Bosmer, lots of people love playing as them. It's not really my cup of tea, but I don't mind playing as them. But they are objectively the worst race to choose because of their stats and bonuses being the worst in the game. Next, you need to choose your gender. Now, male and female Bosmer are both terrible, so you could actually pick either one, but let's talk about how they're a little bit different. So to understand the Bosmer and how they're the worst race in the game, you have to look at their attributes and skills that they start with. So number one, we see the male and female Bosmer. They both start with only 30 strength. Now, strength is really useful in the early game because it means that you can carry more equipment. It affects your encumbrance, and you might be thinking, oh, as long as you prepare well, why should encumbrance matter? Well, you know, you're going to find yourself in lots of different circumstances, depending on if you're in a cave or ruin. Do you really want to, for convenience sake, have to keep going back to your house to collect the right equipment for each individual cave? Or do you want to just be able to have lots of different play styles at your disposal on the fly? Thanks to having high encumbrance, you're able to, you know, have lots and lots of equipment. So strength is a really, really useful attribute, and as you can see, they both start with 30, which means that their carry weight at the start of the game is really, really bad. They can't really carry much at all. It is the same for male and females. Now, the other slightly lesser important part of strength, but still a contributing factor, is strength affects your melee damage. It doesn't affect your melee damage by as much as just leveling up the individual skill of the weapon that you're choosing, but it does a little bit, so that's another contributing factor. Both of those things are useful, more so the carry weight, and Bosma just start with terrible values for that. Intelligence, Magicka is the most important and useful thing in the game, and with the exception of Nords and male orcs and red guards, the Bosma have the worst intelligence in the game. So they're, you know, I guess you'd say they're mid-table then. They're mid-table in intelligence. This is your starting Magicka, and they only start with an intelligence of 40, which means their Magicka is going to be quite low. Well, why is Magicka the most useful thing in the game? That's because magic is overpowered in Oblivion. Similar to how in Skyrim, everyone becomes a stealth archer by the end because it's so overpowered. Magic was the stealth archer build of Oblivion because spell-making altar, enchantments, and magic is a lot less constricted by things like fatigue and other attribute values. So having a high intelligence just means that you can cast better spells. Willpower is a little bit less important than intelligence, but it does complement intelligence. Now, the Bosma start with 30 willpower for male and female. That's also really, really low, of course. Willpower determines how fast you can regenerate magic. And like I just said, magic's a really useful resource. So, you know, being able to regenerate it quicker is going to be a benefit. However, it's not the end of the world. It's a minor inconvenience having low willpower, but it certainly doesn't help the Bosma's case. Next up is agility. Now, for role-playing purposes, agility obviously affects your bow. It says that it affects balance, but I don't really see how that works in the game. I don't see any evidence how it affects your balance. Apparently it's supposed to mean that you don't get staggered quite so much, but the amount of enemies that stagger you is quite rare anyway. It's things like clan fears and occasional power attacks, so it's not really that common. And I've never seen any evidence to how agility affects your stagger at all anyway. I'm not saying it doesn't, I just don't really see it. But the main purpose of agility is it's basically what strength is for melee damage, but to bows. Bows are incredibly underpowered in Oblivion. They're a terrible thing in the vanilla game. You know, luckily you can get mods that actually make bows worthwhile, but in the vanilla game, you've got to obviously keep the resource of arrows stocked up. It depends on your fatigue as well. And yeah, just, I don't know, just the arrow and bow damage isn't really as high as it should be, considering how much effort it is to be good at marksman. So, you know, agility at 50, you know, that's a high number, but it's not worth it. It's not a very useful attribute, agility. And again, marksman as a skill does more to benefit your bow damage anyway than agility does. Now, speed. Speed is something that's often debated as a useful thing, and it is quite useful to some extent in the hardest difficulty setting, because if you're going to get hit, you're going to die in just a few hits no matter what you're being hit by. So being able to avoid hits is useful. Speed obviously helps you avoid hits. However, speed is only really useful in the early game because athletics is going to be what contributes to your actual running speed more than the speed attribute itself. So this tiny bonus to speed at the beginning, yes, it's useful for the first few levels, but then it sort of becomes less useful as the game goes on. It is one of the few attributes that you can send past 100 and still have some noticeable effect. But again, by that point in the game, you can just use your magic to enchant or enhance your speed anyway. One other interesting thing about speed is it's not only it's not only influenced by your speed attribute and your athletics, it's also influenced by your actual height. And this is why the female Bosmer has a little bit of an advantage over the male for speed. Female Bosmers are normal height. I mean, they're about the same height as an Imperial, which is kind of like the average size of a character. Whereas the male Bosmers are a little bit shorter, which means despite the male Bosmer having a 50 attribute for his speed, because he's smaller than the other characters, it actually means that that plus 10 speed he's getting means that he's just running the same speed as a normal character should be, maybe even slightly slower. So it's not really that beneficial for a Bosmer male, and it's only slightly more beneficial for a Bosmer female. But this is where I'm going to say, like, I think male Bosmers are slightly better than female Bosmers, because even though female Bosmers will get that little bit of extra height advantage for speed, they suffer on the next stat. Endurance is arguably the most beneficial attribute, and that's not saying much because the attribute system in Oblivion, while cool, it's really, really underpowered. Intelligence and endurance are really the only two somewhat useful ones, with luck as well a little bit. Endurance is a bit of a unique stat though compared to the others, because it's the only one that is tied directly to how much of a stat improvement you get. So like, let's say you raise intelligence, you will get a set amount of magicka points based on how many intelligence points you raise by. But for endurance, it's your total endurance with a little bit of a formula, means how much HP you will get on a level up. So, you know, the higher and faster you can raise your endurance, the higher maximum HP you'll have over the course of a game. So the higher total endurance you can get as quickly as possible will influence your final max HP stat by the end of the game. So, you know, if you can get endurance to 100 as quickly as possible, that will maximize the amount of HP that you can finish your character on. And so this is why I feel like the male Bosmer, while being slightly slower than the female Bosmer, the endurance increase to have higher health across the entire course of the game is going to be more beneficial to you than having a slight speed penalty at the very beginning of the game. Because the beginning of the game isn't really going to be where you struggle. It's going to be the middle to late game where the enemies really start to get more difficult. You know, when clan fears start showing up, when ogres start showing up, things like that. Personalities next. It's an absolute garbage attribute. You can just use charm spells, and failing that, you can just bribe people to get the information you need. Personality. If personality would only be useful if it was invested in the same way that New Vegas handled speechcraft and personality. New Vegas did a really cool thing of actually making speech a viable playstyle across the entire game. Personality and speechcraft is so useless. So the fact that they have low stats is bad, but it's not the end of the world because it's a garbage attribute anyway. They could have starting personality set to 200, and I would still say that Bosmer are the worst race. So that's how garbage it is. Luck is another interesting one, because obviously luck doesn't govern any skills, but it's 50 across the board for every single race, so it's not going to come into play. But luck, obviously, it's useful if you get it high in the early game, but then it becomes less useful as the game goes on. Contrary to popular belief, luck does not affect what loot you're going to pick up along the way. All it does is it gives a slight hidden bonus to some of your skills when you play the game, which is obviously, again, useful in the early game. But by the mid to late game, when your skills are getting to level 100, then, you know, the extra value that luck would give your skills becomes less valuable. The only other benefit you can use with luck is it makes betting on arena fights a little bit more favorable for making money early on. But yeah, it's not really a contributing factor to picking the worst build. Now, underneath luck, you can see another row, which is the magicka bonus. Now, only two races get a bonus to their magicka. It's the Altmer and the Bretons, which is why they're some of the best races in the game to choose. Every other race doesn't get a bonus to magicka, and Bosmer is no different. So, you know, that doesn't really come into play. Just another reason why Bosmer are not as good. Now we move on to the skills. So let's see what skills Bosma start with bonuses in. So, number 1, Bosma start with +5 to acrobatics. Now, acrobatics, when it's really high, can be useful for jumping up on high rocks or high pillars to avoid combat, and then you can just rain down spells or arrows on your enemies. Then we've got alchemy. Alchemy is one of their better skills because alchemy can be combined with mercantile so that you're making money early game, but also, you know, making potions and poisons is really going to help you. But that is probably one of the few good skills that the Bosma start with, is that +10 to alchemy. Not game changing, but it's okay. Next up we have alteration. Alteration is very fast to level. It has shield spells, which is good, but that's about it really. Alteration isn't really all that useful beyond that. You can get rings to do water breathing and stuff like that. So yeah, alteration, it's a decent thing to be good at, but it's not the best thing in the world. Light armor is garbage. Even if you're a wizard, it's just better to go for heavy armor because yes, magic effectiveness comes into play, but during the late game, your magic effectiveness will improve as your heavy armor skill goes up. So light armor is great for role-playing and looking fun and cool, but it's not really as good as heavy armor in the grand scheme of gameplay. You should just 9 times out of 10 use heavy armor anyway. So this bonus means nothing. Marksman, like we discussed with agility, think about it like this. You could either you could either manage your resources of arrows and bows and keeping them repaired for less damage than if you just cast destruction spells. Right? They're both ranged. Marksman is harder to use than just casting a destruction spell. It requires resource management. I've already discussed why magic is much more superior to melee damage and archery. So Marksman, unfortunately, great for role-playing as a Bosma, but for actual good gameplay, Marksman is a useless skill. Or at least not very useful. Finally, we have Sneak. Again, Sneak is okay if you're trying to get through a ruin unseen. Beyond that, it's not really all that useful since, you know, if you get your speed and athletics up high enough, you can just run past things if you really want to avoid combat. So, or, you know, if you really level up your illusion, you can get invisibility or chameleon. So, yeah, Sneak, again, great for role-playing, you know, but in practice of good gameplay, Sneak is not that great either. So what have we got to summarize? We've got terrible strength. We've got mediocre intelligence. We've got terrible willpower. We've got agility, but who cares because I'm not going to be using bows realistically. We've got okay speed, but again, it barely makes an impact on how fast you run when athletics is really what you need to get up if you want to run faster. Endurance is mediocre, not great. Personality is terrible, but who cares? Luck is luck. No magic bonus either. So terrible attributes for the Bosma to start the game with. Acrobatics, who cares? Alchemy, that's an okay bonus. You know, it doesn't hurt. Alteration, again, that's an okay bonus, doesn't hurt. Light armor is not useful. I would rather just, you know, get feather with my alteration so that I can just use heavy armor without penalties with a very minor penalty to magic effectiveness, but you'll be able to move as fast if you're using feather, so it negates the whole problem with heavy armor. Marksman, you know, again, just use destruction spells. It'll be better. Sneak, not very useful. Just get your illusion up so you can just cast spells to sneak past things anyway if you really need to. Beyond that, the Bosma have no special resistances. Here you can see how height affects things. So you've got 0.9 height for males, 1.0 for females. Weight, I'm not even really sure how weight affects things. I'm not sure if that means like when you're walking into another race, does it move them out the way easier? I'm not even sure. But yeah, so to conclude, choosing a Bosma, male or female, both are terrible for different reasons. I would say that the male just about edges being better than the female because of the higher endurance. So if I was going to go for the worst possible build with my starting race, gender, it would be a Bosma female because of misogyny. No, just because of their stats. Not super important, again, because personality is useless and really easy to bypass, but it's just another little note I would add on to there. Now, Bosma do start with an extra ability. They start with the Beast Tongue Greater Power, which is something that can be cast once per day. It's command creature up to level 5 for 20 points for 60 seconds on target once per day. Now, because this is a power, it means that it's not affected by spell effectiveness, so you could cast this to full effectiveness no matter whether you're wearing armor or robes. Doesn't really matter. However, command creature up to level 5. That means that after the first couple of levels, this is completely useless to you. So you could get a mud crab to help you. You could get a rat to help you. You could get some low-level goblins to help you. Some wolves to help you. But once you get to past level 5 and the creatures start to change, useless. So it's not even that useful. It's very situational in the early game. And then beyond that, it's completely useless. Like, you can't even use it. Like, who's going to be commanding a mud crab at level 20? It's not going to help you at all. You'll have access to your own conjuration spells if you really wanted to summon something more powerful. Or you just make a better command spell at that level if you really, really wanted to. And then you compare that to something like the Bretons, who have 50% resist magicka. That's useful across the whole game. Or, you know, water breathing and immunity to poison for the Argonians, or resist frost from the Nords. All those are useful across the whole game. And then the Bosma has, oh, I can make a rat follow me for a little bit. Yet Bosma are a terrible choice, which is why we're going to choose them for this build. But yeah, after choosing your gender and race, there's still 2 more things we need to look at. After you've chosen your race and gender, Uriel Septim will stop us a little bit later on to ask us what birth sign we have. Birth signs obviously give you different abilities to start the game with, and, you know, what's going to be the worst birth sign for our female Bosma? Well, I thought about potentially choosing Apprentice because it starts with a weakness to magic 100%. That means every spell that comes our way is going to be twice as damaging to us. However, you also get 100 points of magic, which is huge. And like I said earlier, 100 points of magic is game-changingly strong. And it's for that reason that I don't think the Apprentice is the worst class, because when you're playing on the hardest possible difficulty, most things will kill you in a few hits anyway. So you need to already plan really well for every single battle. This will just kill you ever so slightly faster. You're going to need to get good at dodging attacks and being really well prepared regardless. So I don't think, you know, this is a drawback, but it's more of a drawback if you're playing the game normally because you're not prepared for this level of damage. But this is going to really, really help you. So it's not going to be the worst possible build if I choose the Apprentice. Some people might say the Atronach because of the stunted magicka. Now, the Atronach is a very, very powerful birth sign if you're willing to live with the inconvenience of having stunted magicka, which basically renders willpower completely useless. You can't get magic back by just standing still. You also can't get magic back by waiting or sleeping. You need to replenish your magicka either by being hit by spells and using spell absorption, which gives you a 50% chance of absorbing the magicka. Using an exploit to do with telekinesis, you can do that really, really easily to basically get yourself back up to full magicka, or by using potions. So you do have to plan a lot more, but that just means that the run is more inconvenient, not necessarily more difficult, because the 150 points of magicka and the spell absorption of 50% is really powerful. So the Atronach, while very, very inconvenient, it's still a very powerful class and too powerful for us to consider choosing. The Lady's not very good, but it's okay because it would mean that we could recharge magicka a little bit faster, and it also means that we start with higher endurance, which means we would get to our max health capacity a lot faster. We'd have more overall health by the end of the game. So still too good for us to choose. The Lord, it does have a drawback of having a weakness of 25%, but like we discussed earlier, a lot of things will kill you quickly anyway, so the 25% is not really going to be much of a difference maker. If we said that the 100% weakness to magic over here is not going to be a deal breaker. On top of that, the Lord has a restore health ability, which means you can heal 90 points over 15 seconds. Again, that's really useful on hard mode, which is why we're not going to choose it. Lover's Kiss has a paralyze ability for 10 seconds, as well as a damage fatigue thing on yourself. This is a double-edged sword. It means that you can use this to get out of a really tight corner or a pinch, but you might accidentally collapse yourself, because if you accidentally go below 0 fatigue, you also will fall over and basically be equivalent to paralyzed. So it's still very useful though, because you can use this to get out of a pinch. Even though it could be a double-edged sword back to yourself, still too good to choose. The mage, too good. You get 50 flat magic with no drawbacks. One of the best birth signs in the game. Not a good choice for giving us a really big disadvantage. Ritual is pretty decent for hard mode, because you can, get a guaranteed turn away of a undead enemy. So, you're being pestered by a headless zombie or a wraith and you're about to die. This will make it flee, giving you chance to flee yourself or heal up. You also get the Mara's Gift thing, which gives you 200 points of health. Again, too useful on a hard run, so we're not going to do the ritual. The Serpent has a damage health ability. It cures poison on yourself. It dispels any negative effects that you might currently have. It also dispels healing and positive effects if you have any of those, which is a bit of a bummer. But it also damages your fatigue. And as discussed earlier, if you're in the negative, you might accidentally knock yourself unconscious. So while it does have some utility as a spell, it could end up backfiring, but it still has very, very situational utility, which is why it's still not the worst choice of birth sign. Invisibility is too good. It's not the best birth sign in the game, but having the ability to just turn invisible from the get-go, very, very useful for getting access to some really high-level loot with little to no penalty. Again, if you're in a pinch, just activate this and really, really easily run away from combat. The Steed is a little bit overrated. Yes, you get 20 points of speed to make you a little bit faster, but as discussed earlier, that's not really going to make us run all that much faster, so it's not really worth having a whole birth sign dedicated towards it. However, still having 20 points of speed to help us avoid damage early on, it's more useful than the birth sign that we're going to ultimately end up choosing. Thief has extra speed and extra luck, both okay in the early game. Agility's garbage, but again, those two make it not the worst birth sign in the game, but it's not very good either. Now we get to the one that we would choose, the Tower. So the Tower is the best class for us to choose for the worst build possible, because the Tower has a open average lock ability. Who cares? Lockpicking is really easy. Lockpicks are readily available throughout the whole game, or just get your alteration up to level 50 and you can, open doors easily that way. Not a very useful power even in the early game. And then reflect damage. Now, a lot of people really, really love reflect damage, because I also love reflect damage. I love reflect damage builds, but let me explain to you why this is a useless ability. 5% reflect damage, you are going to die if you are hit enough for this power to become useful. You imagine something's hitting you for 50 damage. You're reflecting 2 points of damage back to the thing that's attacking you, because it always rounds down. 2 or 3 hits from that and you're dead, and you've done like 6 damage to the thing. You don't want to be getting hit. It's not even good as a failsafe, because if you're being hit, you're gonna die. And then other people might say, well, what about getting access to reflect damage for the spell-making altar? Good point. Well, you could either do the quest in the Shivering Isles, which also gives you access to reflect damage at the spell-making altar, by rebuilding the Gatekeeper using, I think it's like the Heart of Shared Pain or something like that. But even if you do, you need a fuck ton of magicka to make reflect damage a viable spell anyway. It's like, I think it's like 2.5 or 3 base cost per % of reflect damage. So it's really, really expensive to cast. You'd be better off like working towards getting reflect damage on equipment than on spells. So yeah, the Tower is the worst birth sign in the game, especially for hard mode, because neither of these are very useful. Reflect damage is absolutely useless on the hardest difficulty, and open and average lock is very situationally useful. All right, Warrior. Warrior is pretty good because it gives you +10 to strength and +10 to endurance, both really good early stage attributes like we spoke about earlier. So yeah, birth sign of choice you're going to choose is the Tower. Okay, and the last thing to finish off is we have to create a class as part of the Oblivion tutorial thing. So again, what is the worst, most useless class that we can make? And arguably this will have more of an impact on how difficult our run is than the race, the gender, and the birth sign. So first of all, you need to choose a specialization. So you can choose between combat, magic, or stealth. Now, combat and magic are more useful. Magic is obviously number one. Getting your magic skills as high as possible, as quickly as possible, is going to make the game much easier for you. So we're not choosing that. Combat, again, it's the second best choice. So that leaves stealth. So what does specialization do? It just means that those skills that are associated with stealth will level up faster than combat and magic. So that's step one. Choose the stealth specialization because they are the most useless skills to level up. Now we need to decide the major skills. Now you get 7 major skills in Oblivion. Major skills like specializations are skills that will level up slightly faster, and they also start slightly higher in level. So we're going to be choosing the worst major skills for the beginning of the game. So these skills are going to be the least useful in the early game, whereas if we choose the other skills, they'd be more useful in the early game, which gives us a better start. And obviously we're trying to make the game as hard as possible from the start. So the skills that are the worst for our female Bosmer stealthy tower lady are going to be security, mercantile, speechcraft, hand-to-hand, marksman, mysticism, and acrobatics. So why are these skills the worst? Well, security, useless. We can just use lockpicks. We can use alteration. We have the tower's birth sign, which means we have a spell that can help us open up to average locks early game anyway. So it's a great choice for a terrible skill. Mercantile is next. It's good for getting a little bit of extra money, but Mercantile is really slow to level up, even if you have it as a specialization and a major skill. It's like set to 0.4 XP per sale, and that's the base. So it takes forever to level up, and even if you do level up, guess what? You get points into personality. Hooray. No one cares. Speechcraft, also useless. You can bribe, you can charm. Hand-to-hand is the worst damage output in the game. People only use hand-to-hand because it's funny as a role-playing option, but, you know, for the hardest difficulty, getting up close and personal is a really bad idea because everything's going to kill you in a couple of hits. So you don't want to be using the lowest range thing that you can use to try and kill something. Marksman is next, so even though the Bosmer have a little bit of a natural ability with Marksman, I already discussed why it's a terrible choice, because we could just use destruction spells instead. They're more powerful, they don't require arrows, they don't require management or conditioning to make sure that it's at the highest repair quality. So Marksman's a terrible choice, which is why we're choosing it. Mysticism, it's a useful spell school late game, but it's not that useful because Soul Trap is good, but you can just get Umbra. Then you've got Reflect Damage and Reflect Spell, really great abilities, but you're just going to instead find items that can do that instead of spells. So, you know, it's a cool school, it's an interesting school, but it's also the least useful school. Finally, we have acrobatics. So it's a nice little bonus to have, being able to escape onto higher ledges. But again, your acrobatics is going to need to be really high before you see any kind of benefit to acrobatics. Like, if your acrobatics is 30, you're still not going to be, like, jumping particularly high. You need your acrobatics to be, like, 50 plus before you even see any benefit from acrobatics, which means it's a perfect choice to have for a terrible run. Okay, so that concludes the worst build imaginable for hard mode on Oblivion, and this obviously assumes that you're playing the game as intended. You're not doing any exploits or glitches to circumvent the challenge, because if you are, you might as well just play the game normally. This also, the hard mode challenge doesn't mean that you should be playing the game inefficiently to make the game harder, like, you know, choosing the worst possible choices in quests. What it means is that when you leave the sewers, you're just in the worst starting position that you can be in for you to overcome for the rest of the game. So that concludes this really overly long video. I hope you enjoyed it, and yeah, if you really want to prove yourself to be an Oblivion master, set up a challenge like this. I promise you, you're going to have a really challenging time trying to make this build work. And let me know in the comments if you think that there's an even worse combination that you could do. Maybe I've missed something, maybe I've got something wrong. But yeah, cheers.